Today is February 2nd, 2023. Welcome to Native Calgarian. Oki, Naganago, Mekoche, Chestakom Aki, or Dekots Nagotine Siku. Hi, my name is Red Thunder Woman. My married English name is Michelle Robinson, and I use she and her pronouns. My Dene lineage roots me in the land of the Great Bear Lake tribe in Treaty 11. My name is Dekot Nagotine Siku. My people wore rabbit skin, so it's been referred to as the land of the hare people. I'm a native to Turtle Island, and my Dene Nation is a visitor to this area of Tincho Tine Indahe in Satu Dene, meaning many big dog town, named after the Calgary Stampede. I was born in Calgary or in Blackfoot Mohkinstsis as Michelle Elliott, an English name that has afforded me privilege in an English colonial world. My mother is Northern Slavey Dene or Satu Dene, but my Indian Act and Post status card by the Canadian government says Yellowknife Dene. Through my father, I am a daughter of the Mayflower and a daughter of the American Revolution, while having a Canadian Indian Act and Post status card, which is a colonial construct by Canadian policies meant to divide Indigenous peoples' inherent rights. Indigenous Two-Spirit or the Indigenous 2S LGBTQ plus community and Indigenous women are at the bottom of the Canadian socioeconomic ladder because of colonial trauma, imposed poverty, racism, gendered violence, and land theft. I do not speak on behalf of all Indigenous, but I share my journey as I walk down the red road. As a Dene woman who has attempted to run after joining harmful colonial parties, spent money to be at expensive conventions, left my home to travel to those conventions just to vote on incomplete policies that still allow ableism, incarceration, and denial of justice, and denial of health services, racism, colonial trauma, and genocide of Indigenous and Black peoples, I have worked to continue reports to advocate for and attempt to work within these systems meant to harm me and my community. I think of all of this today, and I hope we honor the many Indigenous lives lost for the so-called country named Canada. I hope you see your role in the importance of stopping harm, and as a citizen, see your role as a treaty partner in so-called reconciliation. Pride Month should never be one month. It's important to understand the straight agenda and gendered violence was and is forced on this land by Christian outsiders. Land acknowledgements are critical for creating a safer space for Indigenous, as well as honoring the host as a guest and acknowledging your role as a treaty partner. It's important land acknowledgements have meaning. I encourage all folks to introduce themselves with their acknowledgement of ancestors, stories of displacement, and how you perceive your role as a treaty partner, a citizen of Canada, a refugee, or other land displacement, so that we as Indigenous peoples know how safe you are to be around. If you won't pronounce your local Indigenous nation's name, won't say your pronouns, won't say your story of origin, won't acknowledge stolen lands, won't acknowledge imposed economic oppression, or your role in reconciliation, I determine how safe you are to be around my community, my family, and myself. Understanding land acknowledgements and their importance is Indigenous 101 because it immediately addresses colonialism, oppression dynamics, broken treaties, and lies taught today in Canadian schools nationally and told on media nationally. That's why settlers and those who call themselves Native Calgarians or whatever town you might be from, show me you have no Indigenous 101 understanding. Jesse Wente's book Unreconciled explains that perfectly, as do many Indigenous authored books. Land Back is a movement that could save the planet from climate change created by colonialism and capitalism. That would be a part of the treaty partnership and part of meaningful reconciliation and honoring global initiatives like the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. I honor the Blackfoot as the elders and members have been so kind to me on my Red Road journey. Elder Red Crane taught me how to pronounce my spirit name in Blackfoot, and Leonard Kenny taught me how to pronounce my spirit name in Satu Dene. My humblest apologies to the Blackfoot and Dene elders and language keepers as I learn proper pronunciation. I'm speaking to you on the lands of the Niitsitapi, which is the Blackfoot Confederacy. The Blackfoot imposed U.S. Canadian border, the Blackfoot south of the imposed U.S. Canadian border are the Blackfeet. North of the border are the Siksika, Gunai, and Bagani of the Confederacy. These lands are Treaty 7, signed September 22nd, 1877, and that includes not just the Blackfoot Confederacy, but the Wesley, Chiniki, and Bearspaw nations of the Stoney, and the Dene from Tsuut'ina. I acknowledge all First Nations, Métis, Inuit status, and non-status across Turtle Island as the keepers of these lands. All non-Indigenous are treaty partners with the government signing on your behalf. My Patreon account is Native Calgarian, where you can pledge and support. Thank you, previous donors, for showing your support. Some of you may have been wondering about the fundraiser I did for my birthday, and because of your support, I was able to register for the upcoming convention. I may not be able to travel there, but at least I am registered. So thank you, folks. If you value listening or watching and can afford to give, thank you. For those who cannot afford to give, I'd love to hear from you at nativeyyc@gmail.com, where you can send in your comments or questions. Also, giving a review helps whatever medium you're listening from. I have a YouTube channel that you can go and subscribe. You can go to nativecalgary.com for the latest podcasts and pinned posts on social media. So I am really excited to have returning guest Shelley come back. And the reason why it's so important that Shelley's coming back is that, we've been really discussing a lot about autism, about ADHD resources, the lack of resources, mental health in general, and ableism. And Shelley, I'd love to have you come in, introduce yourself, and talk about some of the things that you wanted to really get down into right now.
Hi, Michelle. So my name's Shelley. I go by she, her pronouns. I am a settler on Mokinstis. Sorry if I mispronounced the dyslexia and autism. It's hard to pronounce things, but listening to Michelle, I think I get it. I am very close to Tsuut'ina Nation on Mokinstis. I am 10th and 14th generation on my dad's side, from both his side in Canada, less than my mom's. But that means that they came to the States, but they didn't want to fight and become American, so they came up to Canada because they were loyal to Britain. So my family has colonial ties, and what's the word? Settler. They've been so I know that I cannot change what they did in the past, but I can help and learn and educate myself moving forward.
Yes, love it. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for that introduction. So Shelley, do you want to tell us a little bit about your history and why it is that you know about the topics that we're going to be discussing today?
I am also an autistic individual. I was diagnosed at 37, despite the fact that I had 2 psych eds done in my lifetime, which is almost what diagnosed individuals with autism is psych eds. I've worked in the disability field since I was 19, so 1920, starting working in group homes and just worked all over the community. And also I have a sister who's intellectually delayed. She is born in 87, so I think she's 35. She looks so young, I can't.
She's your baby sister.
Yeah, she is my baby sister. I talk to her every day on FaceTime because she can't use the phone because of her hearing impairment. And so we talk on FaceTime every day, and it's the same conversation, but it makes her so happy, makes me happy just to see how she's doing. Because I can't see her every day, but I do see her once a month, and we talk every day. So I've been around people with high support needs since I was 5. I'm really conscious of language functional labels like severe or high support, or I would be like mild autistic. That is very ableist. So I use high support needs and low support needs because I can become having high support needs at any time. It's I think some people still don't like the high support, low support needs, but it's better than using severe, medium, mild um,
Yeah,
topics.
yeah. I say spectrum a lot,
Yeah.
just because, depending on how far you are or how, and so I really appreciate your help on that. And
Yeah.
I have been trying to promote some work that you've been doing. Do you maybe want to share your website, your new website, so that people, when they see it, they know that's you, one, and
Yeah.
two, maybe they can learn proper terminology as well.
Yes. For my website, it's Shelley with an EY, Autie, AUTIE writer.org, which Audi means is autism, and it's just a shortened form of autism. Um, I've been promoting writing about the blogs are writing about myself and my experience, but I put out guides, especially through my newsletter, that are exclusive to the newsletter about microaggressions, euphemisms, what not to say, and really why not to say it. Because if it's okay to say, oh, don't say this. Okay, I'll just use, since it's Black History Month, low hanging fruit. Well, low hanging fruit goes back to Jim Crow and lynching. So that's why we shouldn't use it. We could just say, instead of saying that, we could say, oh, it's an easy task. Because euphemisms are trying to just change something to make it less, um, make it like more palatable. But when you're using euphemisms for disabilities and indigenous, anti-indigenous and anti-racism stuff, we need to know the history of it.
Mm. It's interesting you brought that up. I just seen in Harvard their female coach was actually getting in a lot of trouble for using the terminology, there's too many chiefs and not enough Indians. And a lot of the, well, there was two Canadian Indigenous folks that were like, I'm done dealing with her racism. And because I
Yeah,
think the average Canadian thinks that's a totally acceptable phrase to use, they don't recognize their own racism. Low hanging fruit, that's a great example for me because I had used that terminology since meeting one of my candidates. He uses that a lot. And,
yeah,
he does a lot of work in the human rights field. And, the power of that and how, unknowingly using anti Black language. So, it's really important that we dissect a lot of that because, let's have a powwow is perfectly acceptable in non-Indigenous circles, not recognizing how racist that is towards Indigenous, that anti-Indigenous terminology. I hear a lot of people use the word, have your tribe. And it's like, you mean that tribe you decimated so that you could steal this land so that you can have potlucks or whatever it is that you think your
yeah.
tribe is? So, it's really hurtful language that is quite common. So I think it's really important. And, even for myself, I've been really trying to tackle the word crazy.
Yeah,
And I'm not going to lie, to me,
it's
some of the
hard.
things that are so normal, um, like voting for conservatives that are, hell bent against our democracy, to me, that actually is insane. And I'm not saying that glibly anymore. I mean it, but I know it hurts folks who actually have disabilities. So, yeah, I appreciate that.
And I think when you say powwow, it's like people don't realize it's such a takes so much time to plan, and it's such a religious, or not really, like, what am I trying to say? It's such an thing for Indigenous. It's very sacred, and people are using it. And let's get together for a 5 minute touch base. Like that is very insulting.
Yeah, absolutely, especially the history of powwows and what settlers did to Indigenous people. So I
Yeah,
appreciate that. I wanted to ask you, so, one of the things that I know just inherently is that if you are a woman, you are absolutely discriminated against in the health sector. And of course, as Indigenous people, even more so. Um, so it's also Black History Month. And I think it's really important for us to point out, like I just did a TikTok actually, and I talked about how the mainstream media is talking about the Pope's visit to Africa and how they're talking about the, anti-LGBTQ2 plus sentiment that is all across Africa. And, the UK and Canada are so guilty of doing this, where they both just magically forget that, the UK has had an absolute hand in colonialism, in, oppression, in economic oppression, in war, enforcing the Christian straight agenda. And magically, that is all erased. So to me,
yeah,
there's a lot of anti-Black commentary happening from our, state-funded um, media representatives, and it ironically is Black History Month. So,
yeah,
like, I really wanted to point that out to folks listening to the podcast because when they don't give the background, they don't say, "Hey, as the UK or Commonwealth, we have, been a part of colonialism that has led to anti-LGBTQ2 plus sentiment." When they just forget that part, what they're doing is making it seem like, oh, those Africans, they're so conservative. They have, they're not progressive. We're going to have to go in there and save them from themselves, as if they weren't the ones who actually perpetrated the hate and the straight agenda to begin with. So I just wanted to throw that out there because it is Black History Month and we're talking about different levels of oppression, intersectionality, and the erasure of responsibility and accountability when it comes to why things are in the state that they're in.
it it's like we can't. Your last guest was amazing. Um, I think he talked about that you can't erase, and I know this, you cannot separate ableism and racism.
Yeah.
And it's completely, because if you talk about the enslaved Africans in the States, they were told to be crazy because they didn't want to work and they wanted to run away. And that's still, there's more to it than that, but
Yeah.
it's just, it started back then and still now.
Yeah.
Like saying that they were lazy, well, no, they worked really, really, really hard.
And they built the
So
country for them. And the other part that
exactly.
upsets me, like I just had a conversation with a friend, and they're dealing with a lot of intergenerational trauma and present day trauma, so complex trauma. And
Yeah.
I love the way people try to erase the fact that it was literally colonialism that has created so much trauma. And because of the lack of resources that are culturally prevalent, it's a continuation of trauma. And then,
Yeah.
we gaslight ourselves because we were taught to hate ourselves thanks to the education system and the white supremacy. So, now we have to really like talk about, no, this isn't you in your head. This is
Yeah.
literally the trauma you're trying to deal with. I shared this really great article about how um, Black men specifically, when dealing with the police, are not allowed to be afraid. They're not allowed to run, and they have to remain calm. And there's no way they can win. So they have to calmly die while being violently attacked by police. And same thing with Indigenous in Canada and in the US, and so there's no winning. So when we talk about mental health, like there's no resources for us. We are discriminated against in the health field, and we are expected to fight our own fight, flight, or freeze responses in order to deal with the state. It's so ridiculous that I don't even know how to encapsulate how ridiculous all of this is. So I just wanted to bring that up too, because when people, think that they might be going crazy, they're gaslighting themselves. There's real reasons for this.
Yeah.
And the fact that Canada, the UK are so, what did we do? I don't know what you're talking about. I'm so blind to all of this. Like they are
Yeah.
perpetuating ableism.
And like even like what they did in Africaville in Nova Scotia. I don't know a lot about it, but I know that they resettled a thriving population in Nova Scotia.
Mm-hmm.
Only because my partner's from there. But when I was, oh, I missed it. That's part of it, autism and memory.
No, that's
um,
okay. And I think that's important while you're on the show. So, I don't want you to feel distracted in any way. But the other part is that it's okay to. Let's talk
yeah,
about COVID and the effects that COVID has had on our mental health and masking. A good friend of ours, had got COVID like I did as well. I've gotten it twice, and they said that their experience, because they do have neurological barriers, that
yeah,
it was like a hard reset to their brain. And all of the masking and coping tools that they have learned over the course of their life were erased, like you would, reboot a
yeah.
hard drive. So I wanted your thoughts on that.
With masking, I have found the older I get, the less I can mask. I'm in what they call an artistic burnout right now. I'm hopefully coming out of it because sometimes it takes a few years, but I'm trying really. This time is different because I know that I'm autistic. Masking, I was taught to mask. I was told I was taught to mask as a child. Like I was taught to hide the emotions, hide, not talk about it. I'm learning emotions now as a 40-year-old woman, the basic emotions, because I don't know them, because it's called alexithymia. I don't understand emotions. And masking was really hard at work. Um, is try not to be yourself, but like trying. But now I'm learning that I have to be myself or I get sick
Yep.
because I can't pretend to be someone else.
Yep.
And I did that a lot during the teenagers and 20s. Like I had no idea how I wore jeans because I can't wear them now. I don't even know the last time I wore a pair of jeans just because of the sensoriness of it. It's just I don't like jeans.
Mm.
Um, so it's learning and knowing that it's okay. I don't have to eat those foods. Like you can put them in front of me and I will not eat them. And it's not that it's insulting to anybody. It's just I can't make myself eat things that I will know that I'll gag on because that's how bad my sensory stuff is.
Hmm.
Um, and it's just being honest with people saying I'm autistic and people will be like, really? It's just like, well, sometimes when I tell people I'm autistic, the um, reactions I get, I've gotten, I'm sorry, from a doctor. I'm like, I'm a 38-year-old woman finding out that I'm autistic. I think it's because I wanted to, not because it just, because that's what they did. And like I said, I had two tests that they missed. Like in 2016, I should have been diagnosed because with the IQ, there's a big gap. And this is where FSIQ, full scale IQ, is wrong. Or not, it's not that it's wrong, it's very biased. It's for the white male child. And it needs to be updated because it's not where for cultural relevances. It's not, it's very biased. um,
Hmm.
I'm sure that I'm missing stuff, but if you're interested, the FSIQ is, there is issues with it. And I had a 46 point IQ gap, and they wrote off my sensory. I could have been diagnosed in 2016 instead of 2020.
Right. So how did you go through the process? Because, like, here's the thing: if you experience barriers as a white person,
Yeah.
you've gone through testing I haven't even dreamed of going through. How would I even start the process? Because if there's one thing I've learned from TikTok, it's that everyone needs testing.
And why, like self diagnosis is valid because there's such gatekeeping towards medical testing in Canada, and the states is so freaking expensive. If you have insurance, private insurance is the way to go because if it's public, you'll be waiting on a list for a long time unless you're lucky and get into a publicly funded one.
Okay, well, let's stop there and let's
Yeah,
ask you about that because
yeah,
for most people, private insurance is not an option. So,
that's
how,
fair.
as a public health, how do we even start that process? Because when I go to my family doctor,
Yeah,
and I like, for example, with my Narcan prescription that I should have never had to ask them to write, I
yes,
had to ask them to write it so that the pharmacist would give it to me. They didn't write it, and I couldn't go through that pharmacist anymore. Shortly after that, doctor left, but I had to call like the Indigenous Services has like an Alberta branch. So I had to
yeah,
call this like Alberta virtual branch in order to get the prescription I never should have had to ask for in order to get a pharmacist to acknowledge that they should be giving it to me. um, so that's how I've been accessing my Narcan, but that was already so many barriers and so much stress. And I was just talking about Narcan. I wasn't even
yeah,
talking about my own mental health.
yeah. I I've been in the mental health field services since I was 19 on and off. So when I was in 2015, 16, they asked, they had some questions about my um, diagnosis, and then they sent me for testing, but they got it wrong. That's why I ended up paying for it through my own pocket, which is ridiculous. I almost said the c word. um, but I find that sometimes I've had people go through the 811 and go through mental health and they get tested back through there,
Mm.
but it's a long wait list. Like even for children to get tested for autism is a year or two.
Yeah,
And
that's,
like,
but honestly, so like what I just learned from you from this short conversation is that, obviously if you go to your family doctor, there's a high chance of discrimination and not
mhm.
getting that referral, and that 811 is probably the best option. And even if you get like a misdiagnosis, you go through the process and you get this misdiagnosis, then you still, as long as you pay, as long as you are a person who has privilege and you can go through private insurance, then only then you may get a diagnosis. Is that kind of what I just heard?
Yeah, it's sad, but yes, that is the truth. Because I looked specifically for a psychologist who dealt with women,
Hmm.
not because the stereotypic autistic is a little boy, little white boy who
Sure.
loves trains and cars. So being a 37-year-old woman, I was already told, I had a psychiatrist told me that I was on the cusp of Asperger's. Well, Asperger's wasn't used in 2016, it stopped in 2014, I believe, because of his ties with the Nazis. So yeah, it's unfortunately it's privilege and um, having insurance
Yeah.
or being able to pay for it. That's why
So
self-diagnosis is valid.
Well, so I wanted to point out most of my listeners are in either Alberta or Ontario. So I'd love to hear from folks from Ontario of what your experience of trying to get a proper diagnosis is. Here my guest hasn't gotten diagnosed until her late 30s, early 40s. I'm in my late 40s now, and I still have not gotten proper health care, mental health care. Um, and for the folks in the States who are like, thinking, because I see these Jimmy Kimmel type shows trying to pretend like, or I'll point out Michael Moore trying to point out Canada as being this wonderful place, but the truth is that if you don't have private insurance, you are not getting proper health care. And for folks who may not know, if we get healthcare through Indigenous services, we are 100% discriminated against. As the one pharmacist said, he would rather be not giving services to an Indigenous woman than to be audited. So, but if that gives you any indication of why we have missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two Spirit through the health component alone, it's because we can't even get proper health care without facing discrimination. We can't get proper meds without facing that discrimination. And for someone like me who made him say those words out loud, I said, so just to be very clear, you would rather discriminate against an Indigenous woman than to be audited. And he agreed. Like those words were said in a sentence. And so, how many Indigenous women have mental health issues that they are struggling through without proper help, single moms, whatever, trying to help their kids who may have the same diagnosis, but weren't afforded that same privilege. I'm so tired of people pretending like they don't have a role to play in all of this. Instead they vote for conservatives who are like, fuck the natives and the black people. We hate them. Put them in jail. We're going to get rid of them. And that's what they've done. And as a consistent, let's vote in those conservatives. They know what to do. They're tough on crime, as if the liberals haven't been.
Yeah, and it's like I think they really misunderstand and don't understand defund the police. I like because we're in Alberta, so I say redistribute the funding is take the money. We don't need a tank in the middle of Calgary or Toronto and put it into the root causes. It's just like we don't need militia style funding or army for cops. They have too much on their plate. Let's put it at the root cause so that we can actually have some changes. But I think when Jody Wilson-Raybould came and talked, it's because they just want the 4 years. They just want to be reelected and they can't deal with systemic issues in 4 years.
No, and they need to. I mean, I think the current sitting City Calgary Council are human rights abusers for no other reason than they purposely allowed in residential school survivors to have amputations. They think that was somehow acceptable. I blame the sitting current conservative government provincially for the same thing because they're supposed to be providing. I blame the very organization I'm a part of federally for the same thing because we can't claim we're trying to work on reconciliation while purposely putting Indigenous people on the streets, purposely not housing them, purposely denying them health care. Like it's so incredible to me that anybody in this country is a-okay with this current status quo. And ironically, because we've had a Muslim mayor and now we have a brown woman mayor, people think we're progressive. And I'm like, if progression is killing and continuing genocide on Indigenous people, I do not want your idea of progress. This is
No,
disgusting. Like how people cannot see how incredibly conservative the very liberals they claim are in power causing the problems. Like they're killing us. They're killing us
exactly.
through policy.
And I would say that Indigenous who have disabilities are very much at risk. And I think the statistic of who has been hurt by the police is, I think it's like for the 56 or 60% or even higher have disabilities.
Yeah, we just seen a video coming out of Vancouver of a 12-year-old boy with autism who was Indigenous and them cuffing him and, being completely surrounded and supported by white teachers. And, it's this is the state. Like, I don't want to send my daughter to a school I know is going to mistreat her. I cannot do that anymore. So of course that's why she wasn't in the one for junior high anymore. I have nothing but good things to say about the high school she's in currently, but it's so, as a parent trying to struggle with intergenerational trauma, complex trauma, racism even within your own family, and then trying to have your daughter thrive. And that's one kid. I would have had more kids had I didn't face the racism I did giving birth at the Peter Lougheed. I and I just every system is set up against us. And ironically, I see myself as a person of privilege.
Yeah. And I see myself as a person of privilege because I do have privilege and I do have oppressions through the autism. As
Yeah.
soon as I say I have a disability, people assume I'm dumb. I've been fighting that my whole life.
Can you speak
Um,
up, Shelley?
yeah. Oh, it's just like, and that's probably why I continued to do my master's is because I didn't want to change my, I didn't want to change the routine because I'm so routine focused and changing, like leaving school was like a big thing for me. And um, because I've been called stupid my whole life and
Yeah,
been, and or like my friends always tried to beat me because they thought I was a smart one, but then I'd have teachers call me stupid because I don't process information the same way as other people do. And if I'm a cis white female who got missed for so much, what is somebody else who has less privilege than I do who's missed?
yeah,
Like I had about my hand, I had something from birth. It wasn't found out till I was 38, and it caused a blood clot because it was an aneurysm. Like if that's not if I'm going through that, what is somebody else who is more marginalized? That's why I fight
yeah,
because I use my privilege to fight because if this is my experience, what is somebody else's experience who has
yeah.
say intergenerational trauma? They're
Hmm.
not going to get diagnosed with a learning disability if they're just like, oh, it's just trauma.
Yeah, no kidding. I wanted to ask you, what excites you, Shelley?
What excites me is working together with the Reconciliation Action Group. I know I've missed the last two, but we went away for our anniversary. Um, but it's just
Congratulations.
working. Thank you. It's been 16 years, and people are like, "Really? You have a 16-year relationship with having?" Mark is just so laid back. That's why I'm a bit uptight. But what excites me is just working and learning. Like for the your book club, the new book, Life in the City of the Dirty Water, is an amazing book. Just like how clear he is, like, and it's just learning because I know it's a privilege to learn about these things, So what excites me is learning more and being able to apply it to disability
Well, that's
in
great.
both volunteer and when I'm working.
Sure. Yeah. Is your favorite comfort food and why?
My favorite comfort food right now is yogurt and granola.
Mmm,
But
right
it's a
texture.
specific, yeah, it's a specific granola, and it's got peanuts and dark chocolate, so it tastes like a Reese's.
Oh, that sounds
Yeah.
great. Well,
Yeah.
thank you. Thank you. Do you have an irrational pet peeve or phobia?
My rational pet peeve is when people say you people. It's
Oh,
like I hate that.
yeah.
Even if like they don't mean it meanly, they're like, oh well, you people with disabilities. It's just like, no. You can join us at any point, like
Yep.
even temporarily. So language is my biggest, it's my where I research the most.
Yep.
And because I've done a deep dive on a lot of language, especially not just disability,
Yep.
but others, because when you know better, you do better.
I've once heard temporarily able-bodied, and I think that that is how we need to really address life until we accommodate everybody with a disability in some capacity, because we are only
Yeah.
temporarily able-bodied. And I hope COVID had showed us that, if nothing else. Do you have a
Yes, and
phobia?
a phobia probably, but I can't even think of one.
Spiders.
The Yeah, spiders and snakes.
Okay, perfect. Well, I really appreciate you entertaining me with some questions that I'm going to start try to asking people about. But just to be consistent with some of my guests,
Yeah.
see what it is that makes them take a little off the topic of what we're discussing. And
Yes.
do you have any lasting advice before we wrap up?
Yes. If you want to get diagnosed with ADHD or autism, it can be it may be able to be helpful in Canada because of the disability tax credit. And you can go back on your taxes. I think it's 5 years they'll audit, so you can get money back if you're working.
Wow,
So seeking out a diagnosis and paying for it may be advantageous to you. It may not be. I sought out the disability tax credit just in case I become sicker later to
sure.
have in my life, but I found out that it was worth it. But in the States, people in court, like there's still places that I've read that if you have a disability and you have kids, they can take your kids away. So it may not be advantageous to actually get a disability, um, get it like permanently labeled. Um, I'm not sure. I haven't gone down that road in Canada, but that's just my thoughts. It might help you with the disability tax credit because then you also get that applied further to your taxes.
Well, and just what you said brought up two things. One, Kent here used to go down to, we call it crack marks, but that's a really bad term. The
Yeah,
McDonald's that's down on Stephen Avenue and
yeah,
7th. And he would go and he would help people with, forms and such talking about this. Because I honestly believe there should be like a regular check-in about all of the services for folks with disabilities. And I'll give a shout out to Action Hall Dignity Action Hall. They're an
yeah,
organization that helps folks with any type of barriers that they're facing. But the other part is that because Kent was able to run, um, you know, maybe it's something you should consider because he used his platform in the best way I think he could possibly use it. And I can see
yeah.
you're doing the same. So I just wanted to throw that out there. And then there was one other thing I was thinking of from what you said, but I can't, it escapes me. So,
I'm
um,
trying to write a book about language and disability and ableism. I'm
sure.
not trying, I am. I'm
Yeah.
just a little stuck, but I'm doing it.
Good for you.
Yeah,
Yeah. And we'll have to come back on here. And of course, while I'm sharing your resources on social media, for a
yeah.
lot of folks who are only listening through podcast only, that's their only way of hitting us. Can you just say your website one more time for them?
It's Shelley with an EY, so SHELLEY, Audie, AUTIE, writer.org.
All right. Thank you.
Thank
And then
you.
hopefully folks can access some of that information there too, because I think it's important that we get proper diagnosis. Oh, I know what it was going to be. One of the people that inspired me is Velvet Martin. She lives in Edmonton, and she created what was called Samantha's Law. And Samantha was her child that passed. And it's because just because you brought up apprehension based off of disability, it was actually just standard practice in Canada to apprehend any child with a disability and assume state control. And the rationale was that that way the child would get the best services. But she found the opposite, that the child not only did not get the proper resources, but then also died as a result of not getting her mother's love. And so she created Samantha's Law so that the resources that are supposed to be available are given to parents first. And I know she wanted to do the work of doing that nationally, but it's not fun and easy to be grieving your child and literally to have it be murdered by colonial state violence. So, I just want to give a shout out to her and the work that she's trying to do, and encourage folks to understand the gravity of being able bodied in an able or ableist society, that we don't even think of parents with disabilities, let alone the parents who may have a disability. Canada has an ableist idea where it's like, well, you're thriving, you're fine. And that's ableism.
And if we just like, I was talking with another podcast, like downtown, they have like some of the places have 3 steps to get in it. How just to make like a ramp or get rid of those 3 steps.
Yeah.
It just would make the world accessible to everyone. Like curb cuts were for people with disabilities, but they make it helps people with buggies, moving, elevators. Elevators were for people with disabilities, but it helps everybody. Who wants to go up to the 8th floor? I don't want
Not me.
to.
Thank you,
Or an
Shelley.
escalator. Yeah.
Yeah. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we
No,
do our
you're
closing
the
resources?
quote. You're right. Temporarily abled, permanently disabled.
Mm, right?
Yeah, and it disability intersects with everything. We're the largest minority group ever,
Mm,
or marginalized group, and it's probably underreported because of the stigma and stereotypes and the gatekeeping of testing.
yep. Agreed. Well, I'm really grateful that you came on today, and thank you so much. I hope that helps folks, even for myself. Like I feel like, okay, the barriers I'm facing right now are really real, and of course that's why I probably haven't been diagnosed. So, we'll go from there. But in the meantime, thank you for bringing up the Reconciliation Action Group. I encourage my listeners, if you're in Ontario or anywhere that you're listening from, if there's not a reconciliation committee in your vicinity, whether it's at work, whether it's at your volunteer work, your sports club, please make one. Please get moving on this. I know that there are Indigenous people in your life that would help you so that it can still be Indigenous led, and educate yourself so that we can start moving together as a society. Because ironically, if we were good treaty partners to each other, then everybody would live equally. And so that's my goal. And I know that's the goal of a lot of folks. I'm really proud that this podcast has given solutions and included cultural safety training, cultural first aid, and all of them to create a safer space for Indigenous folks with disabilities, people of color, and to us LGBTQ to speak. Thank you to authors Cheryl Ward, Chelsea Branch, and Alicia Fritkin for heretohelp.bc.ca. What is Indigenous cultural safety and why I should care about it? Their work and those cultural action tools are available, so please support Indigenous work like this as part of your reconciliation work and settler understanding. I'm just lucky enough to highlight and repeat it here. Internalized racism or lateral violence is another form of violence Indigenous and marginalized folks experienced by the structure of racism imposed on these lands. Donna Bevins has a great piece on what is internalized racism, along with many others at racialequitytools.org. So I highly recommend it. Right now, there's so many resources from the Black community coming out. It shouldn't, and people should pay them for these resources, but they're there. So, there's no excuses anymore. Do's and don'ts for bystander intervention. A lot of times you'll see somebody being mistreated, and there's some ideas here to help you through that. So if you go to American Friends Service Committee or afsc.org, there are do's and don't bystander intervention ideas for you. Indigenous have been talking about our issues, sharing our traumas in reports, commissions, and in public hearings, just so it can be regularly disregarded. Calgary, holy, no more. Honor our words, honor the treaties, listen to the politicians and their policies and platforms. If they don't recognize the marginalized in their budget with Gender Equity Plus, if they are cutting violence prevention programs and Indigenous education, uterus health choices, gray, bleh, gay, straight alliances, lack of human rights for migrants, immigrants, folks with disabilities. Know that your vote to that party directly negatively impacts marginalized people. Demand that they implement the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action, the recommendations of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, the multiple reports about child welfare reform and violence prevention, and now 231 calls to justice from the National Inquiry on Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, Girls, and Two-Spirit. Provincially, the Kenney government created 113 pathways to justice, so all the blue voters should be holding their blue MLAs to account on it. Follow the new Premier's Council on Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls work. I haven't seen them do a damn thing, and opposite, I've seen them to do some really problematic things against our people, violent. Municipally, with the White Goose Flying Report. We're supposed to have a conversation this week about it, but that's been moved yet another month. Denying these reports is a form of abuse called gaslighting. Our people are experiencing extreme racism in the educational, justice, health, media institutions with multiple reports that say the same thing. Demand change from election platforms and politicians if they don't understand colonialism, racism, privilege, sexism. They literally have zero business running, should be understood by all parties, local politicians, community organizations, sports clubs. Google articles on how non-Indigenous Canadians can become allies, because they're out there. Stephanie Harp and I had an emergency podcast in the hopes that we could reach our allies to write and do more on the crisis we're facing. FYI, didn't receive a damn word from any of them. So yeah, our so-called allies, I don't know what you're doing, but I sure wish you'd let us know, because we're not seeing you do any act of the action part. Sign up at aboriginalalert.ca. You can also get a Missing Children's Society of Canada app. You can go and read, demand an urgent action to protect the lives of Indigenous women, girls, two-spirit, and gender diverse people experiencing homelessness at womenshomelessness.ca. But I don't hear anybody talking about that either, or tagging me in it in any of the social media. This government, every order, has absolutely not responded to the drug poisoning crisis that we're experiencing. So if you know someone that is using, please just don't use alone. If you are using alone, there's a national overdose response service. You can also call at 888-688-NORS for support. There's a Brave and Doors app. There's a zero transparency and accountability on that. Apparently, there's a new app that is helpful for BC. So if you're in British Columbia, please look at these as options to deal with this crisis that we're dealing with, that our local politicians and local voters are just, I don't really know what we're talking about, because they get the privilege to not care. If you're experiencing emotional distress after anything we talked about today, call the First Nation and Inuit Hope for Wellness helpline at 855-242-3310. It is open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They also have a website, hopeforwellness.ca, and a little text box there as well. If more related to missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirit, you can call 844-413-6649. It is available 24/7 as well. For non-Indigenous, you can always call a distress center line in your area, because it's shocking, the policies are designed for you to have services. Here in Alberta, there's a functioning 211, and that works in a lot of provinces across the country. But there's also 833-456-4566, and you can go to crisisservicecanada.ca. 60 Scoop Indigenous Society of Alberta is ssisa.ca if you're looking for more of that. The following are 2S LGBTQ crisis supports that are available in most places across Canada. You can go to lifevoice.ca and get tons of different supports. The Trans Lifeline is 877-330-6366. and the Trevor Project's LGBTQ youth line. Notice they don't have two. 1-866-844-7386. Just before I continue, I just wanted to throw out there that there's been multi protests and counter protests to the drag community. Next weekend, the 11th and 12th, we have yet more happening. So I'm really disappointed to find out that one of the preachers is Métis. So I don't know if there's any Métis listening to this, but one of yours needs to be collected, and his name is Derek, and you need to collect him because he obviously is oblivious to the harm that the Christian church has done to our people. And the other part is that, if you're a Christian, rather than trying to, um, focus your energy in places that need to be Indigenous led, why don't you focus on your churches? Because there are a lot of calls to action not happening. And now you're radicalizing Indigenous people to hate their own people and hate themselves. So there's a lot of work to do. And I'm going to say it again, the straight agenda was imposed here through hate of Christianity. So please, if you legitimately care about reconciliation, why are you not doing more work in those fields anyway? Violence is my everyday reality. Every Indigenous generation has faced it. This is self care, how I take my power back, and how I call out the racism I see in mainstream media every single day. That's why I started this podcast to speak without interruption, tone police, leadership shaming, gaslighting questions, as many people don't want to hear Indigenous opinions, but sure want to tell us theirs, even though they know nothing about us. I and many others share info on microaggressions, so it's unacceptable to say them anymore. Learn about being trauma informed. I am very shocked at how many folks are still unaware that when you're dealing with intergenerational trauma and complex trauma, how to navigate those waters, and we're still not there. So if you're not trauma informed, you likely aren't in the right spaces to be talking to Indigenous people. Folks like me are dealing with internalized racism, gatekeeping, um, so much racism. Folks that live off the status quo, folks who are in the trauma, people who are trying to do the work and deplete personal resources. Internal, external racism is an everyday reality for me, Indigenous people, folks with disabilities, QT, BIPOC, and others. Mossy Cho to my ancestors, to my granny, my mama, what strength looks like through your example. I want to thank my dad for teaching me to be strong and blunt, my stepmom for showing me what a proud culture is through her Austrian family and roots, and stepping up and teaching me to be a proud Calgarian. Mr. Her, I'm a second generation Calgarian. Thank you to my husband Darcy, Big Buffalo Rock Man, for producing and editing the show. Top of being my husband, childhood friend, father of our child, and support down my red road of the or my journey down the red road. He's witnessed decades of racism and sexism. And to our child, Thunderpipe Necklace Woman, we are blessed to learn from you daily, and we are honored you chose us. You give me daily accountability to be a better and stronger person. My hope is that my family and my daughter will be proud in the future of us trying to discuss these present day issues. My Patreon account is Native Calgarian, where you can go pledge and support. Thank you to previous donors for showing your support. If you value listening or watching and can afford to give, thank you. To those who cannot afford to give, I'd love to hear from you at nativeyyc@gmail.com, where you can put in your comments or your questions. You can also go to my YouTube channel to subscribe. NativeCalgary.com has the latest podcasts and all the pinned posts on social media. On January 4th, I put out my birthday wish to go to Ottawa on May 4th, and I'm definitely not at my goal to be able to go, and certainly not bringing my family. So if you'd like to make a one-time donation to help me run, please don't hesitate to do that too. And I want to end by giving side-eye to the Calgary Rabbits. You're lucky I'm not your dish. And my beautiful cousin once responded, or you'd be in my dish. So thanks, folks, for listening. I appreciate it.